Steve is passionate about the importance of decarbonizing our world as quickly as possible and the essential role of electric vehicles in helping to reduce our emissions. Steve has designed, built, researched, and taught renewable energy systems, technology, and policy since 1982. He established the Sustainable Energy Systems Engineering and Technology program at St. Lawrence College in Kingston, the first of its kind in Canada. There's lots to learn about electric vehicles, and I hope Steve's talk tonight will go a long way to informing all of us about the importance of transitioning to EVs if we need to drive. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Kathy and Karen and Margot, for making this happen. And I'll just switch to the slideshow, which I think, hopefully, can I just get an acknowledgement that everybody sees this lovely landscape shot here? Okay, good. And can you see my cursor moving as well? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, so thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. And yeah, I hope that if you've been thinking about EVs, maybe you're sitting on the fence, maybe you're leaning one way or the other, that the information you get tonight sort of leaves you with the answers you need. And if it doesn't come in the presentation, hopefully it does in the questions afterwards. So I like what Kathy just said, about if you need to drive, because that is sort of a fundamental part of, the problem is that we all tend to, in Canada anyway, if we have the money, we tend to drive. So that's another aspect to look at that's really important. But if you need to drive, let's look at a way we can do it with less impact. So here we go. This is who you are, and that's who I am. And there is a website that I maintain called carbontakedown.com. And I'll put this presentation there within sort of 10 or 15 minutes after the talk, well, after the questions in the talk, because there is a lot of information in the presentation that you may want to go back and look at some of the slides. So don't get shocked when you see slides with tons of information, because they are intended to be looked at afterwards and not totally absorbed during the talk. Is everybody hearing me okay? Okay, I'm getting nods, good. Okay, so, some of you have probably seen these kind of pictures, and to me, this just brings back the sort of critical and existential problem that we're faced with greenhouse gases. If you were to drive 50 kilometers, if most of you are in Toronto right now, and you drive to Oakville, you'd basically, or Oshawa, I should say, you'd basically be in outer space. And the atmosphere is, very, very far from infinite. And there's enough of us in what we're doing, burning fossil fuels and using other chemicals, that we're contaminating this airspace, and that's the whole, climate change issue. And I'm not going to dwell on that, because I think that's what your group is about, and hopefully the science is pretty clear to everyone. So what are we going to talk about? You and electric vehicles. So you'll see EVs a lot. That's electric vehicles. We're going to discuss a number of topics on just sort of you and EVs, and then we're going to look at EVs and the world. So the bigger picture is sort of the issues that are commonly phrased as, the problem of the commons, and how do we deal with the fact that it's free to pollute the atmosphere, and what are we going to do about that, and how do EVs fit into that in the bigger picture. And then we're going to do questions. So what is an EV? And there are a couple of distinctions here. So we've got a couple of real simple cars. And on the left, there's what we call a battery electric vehicle. So battery electric vehicles have only a battery as the energy source, and they have a motor and the other equipment needed to drive the motor. There's lots of fancy things that happen to the power in these vehicles to get it to the road. But that's your only source of energy, is this battery. So that's a BEV, or battery electric vehicle. Sometimes in the talk, I'll just refer to them as EVs, but I'm generally talking about battery electric vehicles. Then there's plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So the plug-ins are more complicated in architecture, but they're meant for people that want to be able to drive on zero emissions for short distances. But when they go a long way, they don't want to have the anxiety of running out of electricity, or having to find a charging station. So the vehicle comes with gasoline tank still for energy, and a battery, smaller battery than a full-size BEV, and a gasoline engine that, through a variety of mechanical methods, can either charge the battery or sometimes it can drive the wheels. There's a variety of configurations. And for those of you that are technical in the audience, there's parallel and series configurations. I'm not going to talk really anything about the technical aspects of this, because this talk is really about the environmental impacts of what these technologies can do. And there's no question that BEV overall, can be a zero emissions vehicle. The PHEV will sometimes be using gasoline, and it's very user dependent. Okay, so typical EVs, the batteries are almost always now under the middle of the car, and they're quite heavy, sometimes over 1,000 pounds. It's a great big lump of all sorts of stuff. The battery then powers an inverter, which changes the power to what the motor needs in terms of voltage and current and frequency. And then the motor drives the wheels basically through a very simple gearbox. So you don't have clutches, you don't have all the complicated parts of an automatic transmission that can wear out and fail. The drive line of an EV is very simple, really. And if you want to make it, some cars come with just two-wheel drive in the front on EV. Some cars come with it just on the back. But the cool thing about EV is if you want to make it four-wheel drive, you just stick another electric motor in the back and put some power to it, and now you've got four-wheel drive. You don't need transmissions and drive shafts and all sorts of stuff to lengthen the vehicle. So four-wheel drive, other than the cost, I mean, technically it's quite simple, and there are quite a few four-wheel drive EVs coming down the pipe. Not so many right now, but there's a whole whack of them coming in the next year. So if that's something you've been waiting for, been sitting on the fence for a four-wheel drive EV, they're on their way. So I'll just quickly take a look too at the emissions with gasoline vehicles. There's all these impacts basically from the refining and extraction of the fuel to the burning in the engine of the actual vehicle. There's upstream emissions. We all know about that in the case of the oil sands / tar sands in Alberta and all the issues there with environment and pollution. In other cases, it's the Gulf of Mexico or wherever that we're extracting oil from, and all those issues. And then there's the burning of the fuel, which produces all sorts of different emissions. Carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas we're concerned about, but also other pollutants, which we would commonly sort of call smog. And then there's this one people don't think about too much, which is brake dust. And there's a lot of brake dust that ends up on the streets and in the air from gasoline cars. When you stop, they use friction, and the friction creates heat, and the heat deteriorates the brakes. EVs use regenerative braking, and they do produce some brake dust, but far less than conventional gasoline vehicles. So in EVs, the big question is, where does this electricity come from? So depending how we make our electricity, the EV is more or less polluting. That can be a disadvantage if you're in Tennessee on coal power, but it can be an advantage in a place like Ontario, where we have very clean electricity. And the other thing about that is that as the vehicles age and our grid hopefully evolves to be cleaner around the world, EVs become cleaner because they're using electricity that is produced in cleaner and cleaner ways as we, hopefully successfully remove coal from our generating systems worldwide. So that's just a little bit about the environment end. And then this is a horrible, complicated diagram, but what I want you to see in this is that this big blue chunk here, these are Ontario's emissions for a year, greenhouse gas emissions, 159 million tons in Ontario. This is the last year that I could get data for, 2017. And this big red slice that I just put in here is the amount from passenger vehicles. So 34 million tons. So it's not quite a quarter of Ontario's emissions, but it's getting pretty close, and it's growing, is greenhouse gases from our vehicles. So this is the chunk that EVs, over the next 30 years, hopefully as we go to a net zero society, that's the chunk of this pie that EVs can take out. There's lots of other challenges too. In terms of homes, just for example, homes are about half of this big red piece over here. So EVs potentially could still reduce about twice the emissions than if we took all our homes off of fossil fuels. So they're big in terms of the overall Ontario impact, and that's important. There's no magic bullets in any of this. There's just no magic bullet. There's got to be emissions taken out of every sector of our economy, basically. But EVs have a big opportunity. So the reason they're so good in Ontario is that we have a very clean grid. We use some natural gas. We got rid of coal years ago. We use some natural gas, but our electricity, if we look at it per kilowatt hour, has about 13 to 44 grams of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's, I'm going to make that more relevant in a few minutes, but just sort of remember it's under 0.1 kilograms per kilowatt hour. So under 100 grams of emissions per kilowatt hour of energy. And a typical EV has between 50 and 100 kilowatt hours of energy stored on board. So if we look at typical vehicles, and now I'm going from grams to tons. So a typical gasoline vehicle is about 2 to 8 tons per year, driving about 20,000 kilometers. Doesn't matter what kind of numbers the automobile maker tells you. They say it's like a partial zero emissions vehicle or something. All that matters is how much gas you burn. It's not even how cleanly it's burned, really. If you burn the gas, the carbon goes into the atmosphere, and vehicles driven 20,000 kilometers produce sort of 2 to 6 to 8 tons. Just for example, a house on natural gas, typical sized homes to sort of larger homes would be about 4 to 10 tons per year. If you flew to Paris and back per person on the airplane, it's about 2 tons. So your vehicle is a significant portion of your total annual emissions. If you look at sort of a typical lifestyle, and I realize it depends how many people live in your house and all that kind of thing, but we're generally sort of looking at emissions in the high single and low double digit tons of greenhouse gas per year. If we look at Ontario, it's about 11.3 tons per person of greenhouse gas per year. So if you buy an EV, you're going to knock out a good chunk of this 2 to 6 tons. So out of that 11.3 per person in an EV, if you're driving a relatively thirsty vehicle, you're sort of knocking out half the per capita tons per year. So it's a big impact. An EV, by comparison, is 0.07 tons per year in Ontario because of our clean electricity. So you're like, even if you have the most wonderful brand new hybrid, most famous hybrid vehicle, I won't mention too many brand names, but if you have the most famous hybrid vehicle out there, it's still probably in around the 2-ton range. If you're driving 20,000 kilometers, it takes you to less than 0.1 tons. So that's a dramatic difference in greenhouse gas, and that's the problem that EVs are, good at solving. We're going to talk about other stuff. It's part of we go on here. So if I just put that graphically, if these are tons, and this is the kind of vehicle you have, the EVs are down here in the sort of 0.1, 0.15 tons, depending on the size of the EV. Then you got your pickup trucks around 6 tons. Your most famous hybrid vehicle is sort of in the 2-ton range. PHEVs are really complicated because it depends how diligent the owner is in charging them and exactly how far they drive every day. So if they drive short distances and they always charge them up, they're going to be in the very low end. If they get a little bit lazy and they go, I don't feel like charging, and I fill it with gas today and drive to Montreal or whatever it is they need to do, then the emissions will be higher. So PHEVs are hard to nail down exactly. A really, really diligent owner driving locally might be a little lower than this. A less diligent owner driving frequently long distances would probably be up in the range of a hybrid vehicle. But the EV is the game changer, is going to the pure electric in terms of emissions. So just a little bit about the history. For a long time, EVs were really weird. They were just like all sorts of goofy stuff, and they got a pretty bad name in the 70s and 80s. But those days are done. And now EVs are just pretty normal cars. And this is the first day that I had an EV. My son was only about 12 then. And we bought this car in Toronto from a person who had to sell it. And we owned it for about 7 years. Actually sold it to a young couple just a few months ago. In that year, in 2014, about 320,000 EVs were sold worldwide. And there were only really 3 models available in North America. It was very limited selection. But since that time, batteries have become better. Electronics have become more powerful and cheaper. Batteries have become cheaper too. We're just seeing more and more awareness of the zero carbon goal, or zero greenhouse gas goal for 2050. And we're starting to see regulations, whether it's an incentive, whether it's a zero emission vehicle sales mandate. We're just seeing lots of forces driving us to these electric vehicles, and the technology has enabled them to be at a price point now that's affordable by many, many people that would be looking at new prices, a new car typical prices. So what are the reasons why people don't buy an EV? Well, cost has been and is still a major barrier that people think, but we're going to take a look at that because I think it's a more nuanced issue. Lots of people just, how far can I go? I can't go farther enough. I like to drive to Prince Edward Island nonstop without having a coffee or a pee break. EV is going to be a little tough to do that. So some of those concerns are legitimate. Some, once you look at the reality of charging, not so bad. If you wanted a four-wheel drive vehicle or sort of a crossover size in the past, there weren't a lot of EVs in that category, but I'm going to show you there are lots now. Concerns around batteries. Everybody knows about mining of cobalt in the DRC, and I'll mention a little bit about that later, rather than, I'm not going to get into that yet. And then there's also a myth about it taking more energy to make an EV than it'll ever save, and we'll blow that one up near the end of the talk. So by 2018, 2.1 million EVs had been sold worldwide, up from the 320,000. And by 2021, projected this year, over 6 million are going to be sold worldwide. So that anybody who's designing products or entering a business would be pretty happy with that kind of sales growth, I think. It's pretty incredible the way that these products are catching on. So I think I haven't got exact registration numbers, but there's probably about 70,000 in Ontario right now. The estimate is that worldwide by 2030, there'll be over 250 million EVs. Pretty hard number, to put any real stock in. But I think if we're going to successfully, reduce greenhouse gases by 2050, that's sort of the kind of numbers that we need to be headed towards. And right now, it does look like we could well be in that order. There are about a little over 1 billion personal vehicles in the world, about 1.1 billion personal cars. So by 2030, potentially a quarter of them could be EVs. So what can you buy and how far does it go? Here's a chart to make your head spin, and I'm not going to go through it in any detail. It is accurate as of this week. I've priced out every single EV you can buy in Canada. The red ones are vehicles that will be coming in 2022. I haven't put anything in that might be launched after 2022. So that's a terrible way to present information. As someone who taught for 15 years, it's like the worst possible slide you can present. So I did this one instead, which isn't much better, but I'm going to try to simplify it for you a bit. And remember, this will be available after the talk as well. So if you just want to close your eyes right now, that's okay too. So on the bottom is range. On the side is the MSRP, including delivery, and also including the federal rebate of $5,000, which is an after-tax rebate. So I've built that into this. So this is what you would pay before taxes for these EVs. So you can see down here, 40,000. There's a bunch now that are below the $40,000 mark. So the average price of a new car in Canada is about 41,000 as of this year. And then there's, some really fabulously expensive, fast, fabulous machines. But I'm thinking, many people are in this $40,000 to $50,000 range if they're mortals and buying EVs. So what does this mean? Well, there's a sort of interesting cluster right here of cars that do about 400 kilometers and cost plus or minus 40,000. And again, I don't have to mention all the names, but if you're really interested in an EV and you don't need a really fancy vehicle, this is sort of the cluster that has a good range and what I think is a very reasonable price. And then there's another little cluster here that's sort of 200 to 250 kilometers, and they're a little bit cheaper. Some are cheaper, some are sort of the same. So there's cars even in this lower price range. And then there's this bunch over here that actually have a range of almost 500 or even more kilometers, but they tend to be in the 50, 60, 70, and even up as high as, $85,000, $90,000. So there's another cluster there. And then this is where pickup trucks are going to fit. They're probably going to be over $70,000. There's a bunch of them on the way. Rivian, Tesla, you may have heard of some of them, but they are not released yet. We may see Rivian's got a few out, but only for its own employees. They haven't sold any privately yet. So that's going to happen in the next year and a half to 2 years. We're going to see pickup trucks enter. So just to reinforce, there are vehicles in this $40,000 price range which still have good range distances. All the vehicles in red, like I said, are coming in the next year, and a lot of them are four-wheel drive. These are the PHEVs that are available, and this is the range on electric only. So there's lots of PHEVs that are in this sort of 30 to 80 kilometers. The little BMW is a sort of unique one where it has a gas engine and it can go a couple hundred kilometers on electric. It's actually discontinued as of this year. They've moved on to other products, but you can see there's about 40 of these vehicles as well. So I'm not going to say too much more about them. I'm going to focus on the EVs. So how does range change? Well, range is measured by the government, and typically your range would be a little bit better on days that are warmer. So really nice before you need air conditioning, just nice spring days, nice fall days. If the car is rated for 400 by the government, it might go 450 if you're just tootling along at 70 to 85 kilometers an hour. But as you go up, as with any vehicle, gasoline consumption too increases with speed squared. So if you like to go on the 401 at 135, your range is going to be quite a bit less than if you go 110 kilometers an hour. And I don't think anybody goes 100 on the 401 as far as I know anymore. On the worst, coldest days, and I know this from personal experience, having driven an EV for 7 years now, and I'm talking cold, minus 25, minus 30 on the highway, the range might be half. So, if you like going to Tremblant at minus 25 for some nice cross-country skiing, you're going to have to accommodate the fact that the range of your car is going to be less in the winter. And a plug-in hybrid will also have less range in the winter. So if it's 30 or 40 kilometers normally, it's going to be 15 or 20 on the coldest days. Now I'm talking the coldest days, not minus 10, or 0. Really, this is the most severe reduction we would get in Ontario. PHEVs also often, not all of them, but many use their engine for heat. And that also increases the emissions because now you're burning gasoline to heat the vehicle, whereas EVs use electricity more efficiently to heat the vehicle. And then as the cars age, there'll be a few percent, sort of low single-digit percentage loss in range due to the battery aging. These batteries are not like laptop batteries that pack it in after a couple of years, or maybe a camera you've had. An EV battery is a very different animal in terms of the engineering and technology that's put into making it. So their range, their capacity reduction with time is very little. Most are guaranteed for 8 years and 160,000 kilometers, and it looks like they're going to do a lot better than that. If you're not up for a new EV, because a lot of older models had less range to start with, there's actually quite good prices on used EVs, and I'll talk about some of the incentives. So there's plenty of used EVs out there, although I'll just take a moment. But right now, there are hardly any EVs out there because of the chip shortages that are coming into the, or stopping the manufacture of vehicles worldwide. I was helping a couple of friends in the last few weeks buy EVs, and we literally couldn't find one in Ontario in the lower price categories. So it is a bit of an issue getting an EV right now, but it is a temporary shortage. And once production's back up in the new year, there should be a lot more EVs, but the order periods are like 3 to 6 months now in some cases. And we don't know for sure if that will be exactly what it is. Okay, let's take a look at charging. These are the kind of chargers you'd use when you're going a long distance. So this one happens to be in Cobourg. There's about over 15 different networks privately run in Ontario, and there's more in other provinces. And these are the ones where when you plug in, the car is powered by a very high level of electrical energy and charges fairly quickly. We'll take a look at those numbers in a minute. So these ones you can use your credit card, or sometimes there's an app, there's different systems. here's my car charging in Huntsville during the summer. This IV network is actually owned by Hydro One. And so I have the app and I put some money on the app and I plug in, and after about 40 minutes, I have a couple more 100 kilometers. So that's a typical, use. Go do your email, go for a walk, go to the bathroom, have a hamburger, you sort of learn to adjust. And this is not something you're doing every day. This is just on long trips. Excuse me. This is the charger that you plug into for the high power. It has this 2 connectors on the bottom here, which carry high power DC, and then has a set of connectors on the top. This is the port on the car that takes the power. And then there's another kind of connector that which you'd use at home, which usually comes with the car as a low voltage plug-in, or you can have a special circuit like a dryer or stove circuit put into your garage or outside the house. And you would plug this into just this port. The bottom one doesn't get used, and the car takes a little longer to charge. I'm going to show you that in a minute. So there's basically just 2 plugs, with the exception of Tesla has their own plug, and the Leaf and Soul, the Nissan Leaf and Kia Soul have a slightly different connector. I think it's a bit like Betamax and VHS a few years ago. I don't think CHAdeMO is going to survive, but there are a fair number of high-level CHAdeMO chargers around. So if you really do want one of those cars, you can still travel long distances. And then it has a port for the lower charging, which you would do at home. So these are things I've learned about charging. There are also things that are, well studied and well reported on in various, literature around owning of EVs. The vast majority of charging is done at night. That's the way you go at the end of the day. So you're going to plug in. If you're in a condo, it can be tricky. Not all the condos are being very friendly to having EV charging. If you don't have a garage, you have to park on the street. It's also a challenge. But for people that have a garage or a driveway, the vast majority of your charging, you're just going to do it at home. And the only time you're going to charge with the high power stuff is when you're doing long trips. You just don't need to ever use those high chargers on daily basis. And the vast majority of us, not everyone obviously, but the vast majority of us, we drive short distances every day. Even if you're commuting 100 kilometers one way, you can do it with these current EVs. On the longest trips, you need apps, or you need some way of accessing these chargers. Some take credit cards, but not all of them. So it's a little bit of a learning curve to get up on the apps. And I've had a few times when they haven't worked and I had to mess with my credit card or call the center or something. But you learn that, and eventually it will be easier. Right now, there's still some challenges at some chargers to get them working. So if that kind of thing drives you completely insane, maybe take someone with you who is patient with digital items, like a 17-year-old or something like that. Most PHEVs only have level 2 charging because you're not using them to drive long distances on electric. They're just not designed to do that. So they generally only include the level 2 charging. This is what a charging app looks like. This is one I just pulled up today. So it's at the Cadillac Fairview Mall. If you went there, you'd plug your car in, you'd open up this app, it would say station available, you'd click start session, and boom, it would start charging the car. So it's pretty straightforward for anyone that's used to the sort of world of apps. You can also put them on an Android wallet and have them work through an Android wallet. So how long does it take to charge? A lot of people want to know, how much is it going to cost? How many kilometers can I go? So this is a little graph of how powerful the charger is and how long it takes to get 200 kilometers. So if it's a very low powered charger, it obviously takes longer to give the car enough energy to go 200 kilometers. If it's a very, very high powered, and 350 is the highest power available right now, and very few cars, only very expensive cars use this, like some of the high-end Porsches. I'll just click to the next one. So in this low level 2, this is where you're going to charge at home. And basically it's going to take, from 3 hours to maybe 6, 7, 8 hours to fully charge the car. That's if you arrive home and it's totally empty. You're fully charging the battery in your 400-kilometer car, it's going to cost you about $8 to $12 of electricity in Ontario. So it's not a lot of money to go 400 kilometers. And at night, who cares? You're generally sleeping. And then if you are going long distance, or you need to get a lot of kilometers quickly for some reason, even if you're not going long distance, then it sort of depends how fast your car charges. So my car is down in this range as one of the lower priced EVs. It'll take me about 40 minutes to get to 200 kilometers. And it'll cost me between $4 and $9 on the highway. So when I'm traveling long distances, every 200 kilometers costs you in this range is sort of $4 to $9. And depending how high your car charges, if it charges at 350 kilowatts, it'll take 8 minutes to get 200 kilometers. So that's barely enough time to go to the bathroom and check your email, and you'd have another 200 kilometers on your car. I tend to go for a little stretch of my legs, do my email, and think for 5 minutes, and then I'm ready to go. These are the chargers. These are the level 3 chargers as of a few weeks ago in the region of where we live. And so if you have a car that goes 400 kilometers, by about 350 kilometers, you're sort of thinking I should probably charge, because you're getting down to a range where maybe you won't find a charger otherwise. So this is not for, if there's any GIS experts here, I just want to make sure you know, this is not as the crow flies. I used actual road distances of 340 kilometers. 340 is actually a little further than this. So the circle's a little smaller because the roads don't go perfectly straight. So you might drive in that range with a fully charged car, and then you would stop and charge for, let's say, 10 to 40 minutes and go another 200 kilometers to your destination. And that's the kind of range you'd be looking at. Okay, so just to give you an idea, around Toronto, end of Lake Ontario, Windsor, the Muskoka area, all within shot of a typical 400-kilometer EV in good weather. In the worst weather, like I say, you might have to half this range. Terrible weather, that is. And there's also apps which allow you to figure out how to go longer distances and tell you where to charge and how long you'll have to charge. I visited my kids in Halifax last April, just after the worst of the COVID stuff. And this is the route it plotted for me to get out there in my EV. It cost me $100 in electricity to go there. So let's look at cost. Just a simple thing to think about is that to drive an EV 20,000 kilometers a year, typical, modest EV, not the fanciest, most powerful, biggest one in the world, but to drive the typical EVs that a lot of people will buy, it's about the same energy as a hot water tank would use in a year in a house. That's 3,000 to 4,000 kilowatt hours a year. That's, depending on your electricity price, $400 to $600 for a year of driving in electricity. If we look at that over many years, so here's how long you're owning your car, here's the cumulative cost in gasoline or electricity. I've started at $1.45 a liter, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, which is actually a little high. If you charge at night, it'll be lower, but I'm being conservative here. And 4% inflation. We've seen a lot more than that in gas lately, but I use that for the longer term. So if you drive a gasoline hybrid car, again, the most popular one in the world, by about the end of year 10, you will have spent about $17,000 on gasoline. If you drive a typical gasoline SUV, by the end of 10 years, you will have spent about $35,000 on gasoline. If you drive an EV, most of them, by the end of 10 years, it will have spent just under $5,000 on electricity. And if you drive the biggest, most powerful, most expensive EV you can buy, you may use about just under $10,000. So I just like to point out that this is a $30,000 gap between a lot of the sort of conventional SUVs that many of us have owned or still own, and a lot of the EVs right now. On a 10-year level, you're looking at a $30,000 difference in energy to propel that vehicle. And that doesn't include the, we'll get to the environmental side of it. That's just the bucks. That slide will, of course, be in the PowerPoint later if you want to torture yourself by looking at it. So I'll just really quickly do this again. This is I just ran through sort of the cost of owning different vehicles. So Hyundai Kona is available as a gas model. It's available as an EV. Here's the famous hybrid. And here's the sort of, apple pie and hot dog car, the Chevy Bolt. And if we look at the MSRP and then tax, the government has a federal rebate right now of $5,000 on brand new EVs that are under $45,000 MSRP before destination charge. And then you look at the fuel cost to run it for 5 years. So gasoline for the Kona, gasoline for the Prius, electricity for the Kona EV, electricity for the Bolt, and then 5 years of insurance. I just based it about $1,000 bucks or 850 or whatever for the Kona, a little bit more for these because they're worth a bit more. That's pretty much what I'm paying, is about $1,000 a year for my Bolt. 5 years of maintenance. Most studies are showing EVs cost about half the money to maintain. They don't have oil changes, they don't have spark plugs, they don't have air filters, they don't have radiator fluid, they don't have exhaust, they don't have alternators. So just a lot of the stuff that costs you money on a regular car to maintain is just not even present on EVs. So studies to date are showing they're about half the cost. So I put those numbers in from some studies I'd seen. If you trade the vehicle in, and actually downgraded the trade-in values a little bit just so they wouldn't warp the numbers too much in favor of the gas cars. It looks roughly, these gas cars are going to cost you somewhere in the range of $35,000 to $37,000 net expense. And the EVs, depending which one, oh, I'm sorry, this number is actually backwards. I got it. The Bolt should be 30,000 and the Kona should be 36. I'm sorry about that. Those numbers got switched. Something to fix before I post it. But what's really interesting is the tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So these two gas vehicles are going to produce from 10 to 18 tons of greenhouse gas. The EVs are going to produce less than 1 ton, around 0.7 tons. So for those of us, where the greenhouse gas emissions is becoming a major driving factor in our decision making, this is, sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of how the vehicles perform. This number does not include the upstream emissions of extracting, mining, and transporting the fuel. This is just tailpipe emissions. So the impact is actually higher than these numbers, but it's a hard number to get with any sort of proper reference for Ontario. So maybe that surprises some of you. I hope so. And maybe that's what, makes you go to one side of the fence. There is a federal rebate. I just want to check my time here. Okay. There's a federal rebate of $5,000 on every new EV and a federal rebate of $2,500 for PHEVs. On used battery electric vehicles only, not plug-ins, on used battery, the Brigham Foundation, Toronto-based, is rebating $2,000 if you buy a used EV. So the young couple I sold my car to got a $2,000 rebate on top of the price they paid for the car. Bigger picture, let's take a quick look at this. Impact of EVs. If there were 1 million EVs in Ontario and each going 20,000 kilometers, it would only add 2.5% to our electricity grid load. So, yes, there may be more than 1 million by 2040, but that's 19 years away. I think we have time to, design our grid to handle it. So the impact is much less because EVs are so efficient at using electricity. Look at the cost. You're literally using, $4 to $8 to go 400 kilometers. They're so much more efficient at using energy than gasoline cars. It just doesn't take that much electricity to run even 1 million EVs. So that's a really important factor, and it's something a lot of people get wrong. Plus, we can program this charging to be at night. Most people are going to be charging at night, and the cars can be programmed to charge at night. You just set it up so that it starts at midnight and it'll be fully charged by morning. So we can even charge in these off-grid periods. Let's look a little bit at manufacturing. So there's probably about enough lithium in the world to make over 5 billion passenger cars. Now, some of that lithium is going to go to other vehicles like trucks and buses, but there's a lot of lithium, and those are just the known reserves. And the pressure hasn't been on for lithium production until recently. So there will probably be new reserves found, just as there have been with oil. There are other batteries in use, and not all of them use cobalt, the main conflict mineral that we hear about. Tesla's already making their EVs in China with a battery that doesn't use cobalt. So there's lots of people, and some of the best researchers in the world in these battery technologies are in Canada. So what about the human rights? So there's lots of material to make the batteries, but there's no question there's an impact. But I want to counter with the impacts of fossil fuel extraction plus climate change. So we've got the material impacts on the ground, shipping of fossil fuels, tankers, pipelines, all that stuff, plus in our country removing literally tens of thousands of acres of topsoil and trees to get at oil sands. So yes, the EVs have an impact, but we have to counter it with the other impact. The other thing that's happening is that in the extraction of these minerals, almost all the auto companies worldwide have really embarked on corporate policies to source their minerals with a very clear supply chain accountability. So it's not perfect for sure right now, but there is a lot of pressure. And I was just talking to a friend who's involved with mining today, and the ore that they're mining, it's actually a mine in Mozambique. Every bag of ore has a barcode that's tagged for where it was extracted from, and that barcode follows it through. And they can't get funding now from the finance business without having these sort of ESG standards for how they deal with their ore. So I think that problem can be solved, or at least reduced to a point where hopefully we don't feel terrible, about the decisions we're making and what we buy. Recycling is being developed all over the place. So there's even one in Kingston, Ontario, Li-Cycle, and they've got a plant in Rochester, another one in southern states. So I think recycling will eventually become mainstream. There just aren't enough batteries yet. The cars are new, and the millions of batteries that will eventually be recycled are just not available yet. They're still in the cars driving them around. I'll just really quickly do this. I got a couple more slides. One of the things has been manufacturing energy. And if we just look at the greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing a mid-sized car, it's this red slice at the bottom here. And if we look at the emissions of using that car, it's this 50 tons of emissions over that sort of 220,000 kilometer life. So the greenhouse gas emissions of manufacturing a gasoline car and using it are in the use of the vehicle, and they're huge. If we look at an EV, it takes just a little bit more to make an EV because the battery takes a bit more energy to produce, so there's a bit more emissions. And then we use the car in Ontario. This would be the greenhouse gas impact of using the EV compared to this big blue bar on the conventional gas car. And even if we buy the biggest, most expensive EV with a giant battery, the battery might have this kind of impact in manufacturing and use. So it's still dramatically less than a conventional vehicle. And if we power our factories with clean energy, as in the next 20 years, 30 years, then these sort of orange chunks also shrink because the factories would be running on energy that also has low emissions. So the manufacturing energy myths just don't stand up to scrutiny. This is actually an older study. The numbers are looking even better for EVs right now. Okay, wrapping up. I guess, the way I feel about it is we have to eliminate the burning of fossil fuels. So that is just it's got to happen. It's got to happen in the next 30 years. So EVs are certainly part of that existential problem that we are all facing, everybody in the world. Global deployment of EVs will literally reduce, over 1 billion tons, or thousands of millions of tons, but that's 1 billion tons of emissions around the world as we start to, really take a dent out of the existing gasoline vehicle population. Automakers are joining and creating all sorts of mechanisms to source more conflict-free minerals and open up mines that aren't in places where laborers are abused. So I think that problem is not solved, but it's certainly a high-profile problem, and it's being addressed by most automakers. Obviously, there needs to be lots of oversight on how effectively those policies are being implemented. EVs, they solve this greenhouse gas, this existential problem, they don't solve every problem. You know, it's like buying anything. There's still an impact somewhere. A resource has to be extracted, energy is used, but the greenhouse gas emission reduction in Ontario is dramatic. EVs and us, our own selfish interests, we reduce our greenhouse gas footprint hugely. Basically, I think that the lower cost EVs have similar ownership cost, or even cheaper probably in many cases than equivalent fossil fuel cars now. Ideally, yeah, use your car as little as possible. Take other forms of transit in the city if possible. Make your car last as long as possible. You know, if we build less stuff, then there's less resource extraction and less damage to the environment. Gets a little tricky when you start saying, well, if we all drove our gas cars till 2050, would that solve the problem? Well, no, it wouldn't. So we do have to make the transition to lower emission vehicles at some point. Long distance travel is certainly feasible. You need some apps, you need some time to charge, but that time's getting less and the apps are getting better. And that's it. So I think I went a few minutes over, but hopefully we can get into the questions. This is the website, carbontakedown.com. So I'll post this presentation there.
I actually had a question to start off with, just to clarify something. Steve, I was hoping you could clarify for us, which is just to clearly make the distinction between what a PHEV is versus a simple hybrid car.
Right. Okay. So I didn't talk about hybrids, but let's go from the battery electric vehicle, which is battery only, to the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, which can run on battery only for, you know, depending on the vehicle, let's say 30 to 80 kilometers, and then gasoline would kick in, and a hybrid electric vehicle, which doesn't have any plug-in capacity. So a hybrid electric vehicle, you can't recharge the battery by plugging it in anywhere. The battery produces the efficiency in the vehicle by allowing a smaller engine to be used and by allowing the engine to be off quite a bit of the time when you're actually driving the vehicle, whether you're coasting down a hill or going slowly or at a stoplight. And so the hybrid electric vehicle, yes, it produces much better fuel economy than a non-hybrid, but it's still, you know, going to be a couple of tons a year for even typical hybrids that you might drive 20,000 kilometers a year versus the less than 0.1 tons for the EVs. But better to drive a hybrid than a non-hybrid, for sure.
Okay.
I think, yeah, the hybrids and plug-in hybrids, many people feel the plug-in hybrid is an interim step that will disappear in the next few years as EVs and charging structure gets more ubiquitous and people just become more familiar with the apps and they have friends, they have relatives, their kids or whatever using them, that the plug-in hybrid, the PHEV, will disappear within a few years.
It's interesting, and I think we'll get to this because I saw some questions. This is a personal admission. We wound up buying a hybrid because there's nowhere to plug it and we park on the street. And so it was a matter of, do we wait till there's the infrastructure? And I know there are other people in this audience that will be able to talk to that because there are people here, I know we've had these discussions, but it's interesting because what you're saying is even a plug-in hybrid, like I'm hoping our next car is an EV, but I'm disappointed that this car wasn't an EV and that I couldn't see my way around not being able to charge it at home. So I don't know if you want to address that. And I know other people may ask about it and talk about it too.
It's where government policy and personal ambitions collide, because we don't see any government policy in Ontario that's helping people through these charging barriers. I was in Montreal a year and a half ago downtown, and there are chargers everywhere on the street, on poles. You park on the street and you can charge your car for a few hours all night, costs very little. And that's a public policy decision that they've made. And we have not chosen to go that route in Ontario as a public policy yet. Certainly in areas where there's a lot of vandalism, you know, these kind of pieces of equipment may be an issue, and we're going to have to find ways to deal with those kind of problems. But, you know, there's lots of infrastructure out there on the streets. There's lights and bus shelters and, you know, all sorts of machines that people interact with. I'm not saying it's not an issue, but I think it's a matter of public policy to make it work. That means making a priority of greenhouse gas reductions. And we don't have a provincial government at the moment that's made that a priority.
So this is part of your answer. Thank you very much, Steve. Fragel asked early on in your presentation, do you have a solution for street parkers in the West End? And I know there might be some people in this webinar, like in our Zoom room now, that have looked into charging units that are available in the Toronto area and maybe can speak to the West End. I don't know if you can, Steve, or if anyone else wants to put their hand up so I can see you and join the conversation.
I'll let the people who live in the West End speak to the street side, you know, the physical barriers. But maybe here's an angle that not everyone's thought of yet, and that is with the current crop of EVs that can do 400 to 500 kilometers, I guess you have to ask yourself, how often do you need to charge during the week? So if you're, let's say, commuting round trip 60 kilometers a day or something, it means you can commute for almost the whole week or maybe the whole week without charging at all. And then potentially charge once a week, or when you're going on a long trip, charge at a level 3 charger. So it used to be that the idea of charging every day was critical, and it's certainly cheaper to charge at your own home overnight is cheaper. But if you bought a 400 or 500 kilometer range EV and charged a couple times a week at one of the high rate chargers, and there need to be more of them too, for sure. You know, you're going to maybe spend $800 a year instead of $500 or maybe $900 tops. So it would have some impact on the cost effectiveness, but no, I think the street charging is an issue for sure. And it just means at the moment that not everyone, it's not going to be the ideal, an EV isn't going to be the ideal or maybe even a practical solution for everyone yet. But do keep in mind, if the car can go 400 kilometers a week, you don't need to charge every night.
So I thank you, Steve. I noticed in the chat, Evelyn, you asked how practical and costly is it if you don't have a driveway or garage and therefore have to use stations. And is there anything else you'd like to ask of Steve? Because I think you have answered that question, but you might have a different, if I don't know if they're still with us.
A simple sort of way to think about the high rate charging. If you were to charge your EV all year on high rate charging, and you drive about 20,000 kilometers a year, and you've got sort of your typical EV, not some fancy $120,000 one, it would cost you probably about the same as driving the most efficient hybrid gasoline car, about $1,200 a year maybe, to charge your EV every single time at a high rate charger.
Okay, thank you. So moving along, Jill had asked, on your dollars versus range graph, are there any electric SUV or magic van for large families? And
yeah, that's a great question. There is a 7-seater Tesla, but it's, you know, it's one of the $100,000, $90,000 options. There are going to be some of the what I would call crossover / SUV EVs coming in the new year. And I saw when I was looking at them the other day that some have an option for a 3rd row seat. So that would make it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 passengers. But there is not an EV minivan yet. There is a plug-in Dodge Pacifica, which I think has a range of about 40 kilometers. So for urban travel, that can be a solution. But no, there isn't a electric minivan yet. And the 7-passenger EVs there'll be a better selection in 2022, but they're not going to be $45,000. They're going to be $60,000. So I don't know what the price point for that person is, but that's the difference.
Just to add on to this about charging, Evelyn also asked if you don't use your car for a week or two, does the charge deplete?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. There is a small amount of electrical consumption, but it wouldn't show up in a week as even more than a kilometer of difference. So no, you don't have to worry about the cars depleting while they're parked. If you were going to go away for a year, it can be an issue in terms of the 12-volt battery, because most of the cars still have a 12-volt battery as well as a larger battery. But no, it's not something that EV owners really think about in terms of degradation. As it gets colder, if you park your car, let's say it's plus 20, and you leave it for 2 weeks and you come back and it's minus 10, you'll notice the range has dropped a lot, but that's because of the temperature of the battery, not because of the power consumption. Some of the vehicles do use a little bit of power when it gets below minus 10. They'll use some of the power to warm the battery if it's not plugged in, but they'll stop using that power once it's down to a certain level of charge. So that's sort of vehicle specific, but if your vehicle's plugged in, it's not an issue. If it's unplugged, rarely is it going to be an issue unless it's extremely cold.
Thank you. A question here about recycled batteries. Will recycled batteries perform as well as new ones in terms of performance?
Well, when we talk about recycled batteries for EVs, they'll be made from previous batteries that have completely been disassembled, and most of the components end up being dissolved in various chemicals and then reconstituted, much like the original metal refining. So I don't think there'll be any issues. They'll be basically like new batteries. I don't see existing batteries, and I haven't read anybody planning to do it, taking existing batteries and, at 7 or 8 years, taking them apart, taking out a few of the good pieces and making another one. Some hackers may do that, but the recycling business for batteries is going to be, when there are literally tens and tens of millions, and they're going to be ground up into little bits and reconstituted as basically new materials. How long we can do that for, can we do that for, can you send a battery through 50 cycles of being ground up and reconstituted as a new battery? I don't think anyone knows for sure exactly. The economics are probably the main factor that are going to determine. Economics and laws that say we can't keep digging up new lithium, we got to recycle the old stuff. We don't know how that's quite going to pan out yet. It'll be another probably 15 years before we really see how this recycling is going to settle out economically and policy wise.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to add any questions about batteries to that, I'm just looking, because I'm just going to move along here through all the questions. Okay. Michael, would you like to, or Gary? Is it Gary being Michael? You can unmute. You've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a couple of questions. I've been told if you rapid charge your battery too many times in a row, it's not good for it. Do you have a sense of, like, if you're going across the country, if you do it 10 days in a row, is that too much, or is 5 days in a row too much?
No, not at all. No. And
Okay.
the battery manufacturers, the vehicle manufacturers, they do sort of sometimes say things about that in the manual, but not in terms of just a few times. But the battery is warranted for 8 years or 160,000 kilometers. And so I think that the high rate charging is going to turn out to not be a very significant issue. It may have been a bit of an issue in some of the first cars made in sort of 2011, 2012, particularly some of the cars that didn't have active battery cooling. But basically, there's only one model left on the market that doesn't have battery active cooling. Every other car now cools or heats its batteries. And that's going to mean that the high rate charging I don't think it's going to have a discernible impact at the level most people would use it. If you did high rate charge your car, every day, because you drove at 400 kilometers every day and you did that for 10 years, you'd probably see an impact on that. But I don't think it's going to turn out to be an issue from anything I've read. It doesn't seem to be, it's not an issue with the current crop of cars. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't do it on a 11-year-old. I wouldn't high rate charge an 11-year-old Nissan Leaf, the rest of its life.
Another question is there a good online resource for people to answer questions like you're answering today that you recommend?
I don't think there is one. That's sort of why I've found this niche, to try to help people get over this stuff. And I'm not connected to any auto companies, so I hope people take my advice as nonpartisan. Plug and Drive is a great place. Plug and Drive, just up by Richmond Hill, is a great place to go to talk about EVs. Kara Clareman runs it, and she has a staff that can help people answer the sort of day-to-day questions around EVs. They also have a number of EVs you can test drive. I think you have to book them ahead of time right now, but if you're interested in carrying a little further forward in this, I would definitely go to Plug and Drive and have a chat with people there and drive one of their EVs and get a feel for it, and maybe they can help you a little bit further. I do have on my website, there is I guess it's under contact. And, I do try to respond to emails. So if there's something that you did want to ask, you could fire it off to me through the website too.
Okay, thank you.
You're
and
welcome.
Lastly, I'm wondering, was there a distance time calculator that you had on one of your slides?
Yeah, so it's called A Better Route Planner. That's actually the name of the service. And they have a free version and they have a paid version. And if you know the EV you're going to be driving, you put the parameters in for that EV and where you're going and how fast you like to drive and what kind of weather you expect to be in. And it will calculate your stops. And if you pay the fee for the app, it actually goes and gets the weather for you on the days that you're going to travel and calculates it for you. I think it's a much needed service, and A Better Route Planner has really jumped the gun on making it available. I sure found it handy on my travels, but I'm sure there will be other services like that too. But I would add that once you've lived with an EV for a few years, just like with your gasoline car, you sort of know where you're at with your tank and how full it is and how far you can drive comfortably. And you start to get a feel for what it can do. And these issues become less important. But at first, it is useful to have the apps and some of the tools.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I just wanted to add that Henry added to the chat for also in the area of information that greencarreports.com is pretty good for EV news and an active forum. So
that's true. That. That's true. And I have another one I can, whoops. I can't see it right now with the way my computer's configured. Green Car Reports is good for what models are coming out. There is a website called Electrek, run by a Canadian guy out of Montreal. He has a podcast, Electrek, just like it sounds, Trek. And he does really good podcasts. He mostly talks about Teslas, but he covers all the other new EVs as well. So I like Electrek a lot for getting up. He talks very much from the sort of big business end of EVs and sort of what's happening on the global scale. But he also, on his website, has reviews of individual EVs. So it was probably a little short on only thinking about Plug and Drive. There are a few other places.
Thank you. So Alan asked, is there an equivalent to a boost? How is CAA going to help me if the battery dies?
That's a great question. No, it's going to be pretty hard to boost a car at the side of the road. Carrying the kind of equipment that could fast charge on a truck. I mean, I guess theoretically it's possible. Will we see CAA investing at a level where they can actually charge you at the side of the road for an hour? It could certainly be done and give you, or even after maybe 15 minutes, they could give you 5 or 10 kilometers, I suppose, which might get you to another charger. Yeah, that is, I'm not saying it's not an issue. If you run your battery down completely, what the cars do is they first cut your power a little bit so you can't go as fast or accelerate as quickly. And then they cut it a little bit more. And then of course it will eventually stop. I've driven mine 10 kilometers past the 0 point, just up and down a long driveway because I wanted to know what would happen. And at 10 kilometers below 0, it still hadn't stopped. So I don't know how much, reserve they've built in. And people who have run out, end up getting their vehicle towed, put on a flatbed and towed. But I have heard in Europe, in Norway, they do have booster vehicles on the highway because they have such a huge percentage of EVs now. And some of the rescue vehicle or emergency vehicles there are equipped with chargers to boost EVs. So maybe we'll see that, but I haven't heard it talked about yet in Ontario.
Wonderful. We still have a few questions. I think we have time to cover them. There are two that are related. Jill had asked, what is involved in getting a power source at your home? And I think Ilana had asked something similar. What's the cost to install a charger in your driveway garage? So
yeah,
similar.
Yeah, very, very important to know. And I have to, I didn't include that in the cost of the car. So the power that you're going to use at home is about the same kind of circuit you'd put for a dryer, electric dryer, or an electric stove. So probably it's going to be 240 volts if you want to charge reasonably quickly overnight. And it could be on a 30, a 40, or a 50 amp circuit, depending what size charger you buy. The chargers themselves are sort of anywhere from $800 to $1,400. And, installation could be anywhere from $400 to $1,000, depending how far electricians have to run, a 30, 40, or 50 amp circuit. If you have a power panel near the garage, it's going to cost less than if it's farther away. And it is sort of debatable. If you have a garage, do you put it inside the garage? Do you put it outside? Most people are going to put it inside the garage. And then if you are home and you want to charge outside, put it in a place in the garage where the cord can go under the garage door and to the car while it's outside. That seems to be quite normal. So I'd say, in total, you're probably looking at $1,500 to $2,500 for the installation of a charger. I chose in a recent installation to put in a really high amperage charger because I sort of wanted to future-proof myself against cars that will charge at a higher rate at home. So for an extra $500, I bought the highest rate charger I could get on the market, which is 50 amps at the home level. My car doesn't even take that much power, but I thought I might be buying one in 5 or 6 or 7 years, and I expect that charger will last over 10 years. I sure hope it does. And so future-proofing against possibly buying a car that can charge at a higher rate is something maybe to think about as you do that. I think I quickly saw a chat there about someone worrying about theft. Did you read that one?
Yeah, I wanted to add that one as well.
Yeah. So, if the charger is hardwired to the wall, it does mean yanking out an electrical appliance while the circuit is live. I guess, a capable thief with fast hands or insulated gloves, I suppose, can do that. If it's bolted to the wall, you've also got to unbolt it. They could cut the cord and just take the head. It's not worth that much money. So it's, for someone who's desperate, I guess it's worth some money at a pawn shop potentially. So normally the way that they're mounted makes it hard to steal it. You could just bust it, I guess, by whacking it with something big and heavy. So vandalism is possible. I've not heard about it in Ontario being an issue. We did have most cars come with a separate charger. You can just plug into a wall outlet. Let's say you go visit someone overnight and you just want to charge at their house. And we left our car unlocked in the city and someone stole our charger out of the car. It wasn't plugged in to charge. It was just in the car. Somebody thought it was or knew it was worth something, but the car wasn't locked. So, maybe it was just a random theft, or maybe they thought, oh boy, an EV, maybe it has a charger and I can sell it for $200. I don't know. I don't know anyone else who's had theirs stolen. And I know probably 40 or 50 people with EVs, and none of them have had that happen, and they haven't had any issue at their homes either. So I think if you're in a neighborhood where, outdoor devices are frequently damaged or stolen, it may be an issue, but it's certainly not something you can remove from the wall easily.
Right. Henry said, if a vandal unplugs the charger from my EV, a very loud alarm sounds. Chevy Bolt EV, same as Steve's. So
yeah, so you can set that in the car. You can either have it do that or have it not do that. Ours wasn't plugged in. The charger was just sitting lying open in the trunk. So our bad for not locking the car, I guess.
okay. I had one other question based on the cost of putting in the charger that you said came out in a range of 1,500 to 2,500. Is that in your chart where you look at the life cost comparing?
No, I didn't put that in. You're going to have to add that in. Yeah. Wasn't trying to be slippery. I should have put that in there.
Okay,
Yeah.
it wasn't included. Okay. Jill asked, do you need to fully discharge a battery before recharging? If you recharge it when the battery is not fully discharged, does it build a memory and reduce its capacity to hold a charge? And I was going to say, that sounds like a problem with a cell phone, which I have and a lot of people have.
Yeah, it's not an issue at all with the EV batteries. The lithium chemistries they've used in the EV batteries are just designed, and the evolution of battery technology and the expense they've gone to make the chemicals pure in these batteries just doesn't make memory effects at all. So there's no issues with charging to the top or running them all the way down. There is a bit of an issue if you live in an extremely cold place like Alaska, of leaving the battery discharged outdoors for long periods of time. It wouldn't be something in Ontario we'd worry about. And there was one other thing I was going to say about the battery charging. It's escaped my mind, but it'll maybe come back before we finish.
Okay. I think there are just a couple more, which I think we have time to get to. Jill asked, are there other green technologies coming down the pipe that will reduce GHG? Have you any comment on advances in hydrogen fuel cell technology?
Sure. I mean, the hydrogen fuel cells for passenger vehicles has been touted for decades now. I mean, going back to the 80s, there's been attempts, and I was involved actually in previous work with fuel cell development for electric vehicles, in fact. I don't think even though there are some companies that have invested quite a bit in fuel cells and some that continue to push them, there are other companies, big ones, that have completely dropped the hydrogen fuel cell path. If you look at the energy efficiency of using electricity and to make hydrogen in a non-greenhouse gas way, it's going to take energy from somewhere. Cracking methane into hydrogen is not going to solve our greenhouse gas problems like using natural gas. So it has to be made through some source of energy that's clean, and that's going to need to be electricity in most cases. And it makes no economic sense to take that electricity, turn it into hydrogen, compress or liquefy the hydrogen, move the hydrogen to somewhere, put it in a vehicle, convert the hydrogen into electricity to run the vehicle. It's about a 30% efficient use of the original electricity. Whereas if you take that same original electricity and route it through to the battery in an electric car, you're getting somewhere probably in the range of 75 to 80% of that energy back. So that electricity costs you money at the origin. So the economics just don't stack up for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles from an operating cost. Planes, long distance trucks, ships, that aren't maybe going to be able to carry a battery that's big enough to do the job. We may see some hydrogen there, but I wouldn't put all my mortgage money in a hydrogen fueled vehicle fleet yet. There are niche places where it makes sense: underground mining vehicles, forklift trucks, maybe long distance hauling. I personally don't think we're going to see a lot of mass adoption of hydrogen vehicles for passenger vehicles on a day-to-day basis. I remembered what I was going to say, and that is, some of you may have heard about the Chevy Bolt battery fires. And it's true, some Chevy Bolts have caught fire, some Hyundai Konas did as well. And both of those companies are in the process of replacing all of those batteries over 130,000 of them worldwide at no cost to the owners other than the inconvenience. I consider that an early stage failure of a fairly new technology, and we probably won't see that happen too often again as they get the manufacturing wrinkles for mass production out of the system. But for sure, if you have a Chevy Bolt right now, it's been a real pain to be worried about it potentially catching fire. But I think they are replacing them now in Ontario, and I think they'll be for sale within the next few months. They'll be selling Chevy Bolts again that have replacement batteries. So I think that's just an unfortunate part of the history of the EV introduction for GM at the moment.
I just wanted to ask, Frigo put in the chat earlier on, and this is kind of a how to transition yourself question. I think it's relevant for a lot of people that don't yet have an EV. She said, I noticed most of the used PHEVs I've been researching are out of production, no more new models. Is it risky to get a PHEV if they're going out of production? I wanted to get this type of vehicle because I sometimes plan to drive places where I'm concerned there's nowhere to charge.
No, it's a great question. In terms of holding their value, I think, you know, on a 10-year level, are the PHEVs going to hold their value as well as EVs? Maybe not. If an EV just cannot do the job for you right now, and you do want to reduce your emissions, certainly the PHEV is one way to go. If you're driving long distances frequently, which it sounds like this person might be based on the kind of location they're going to, is maybe in a more remote place. I think it's actually a little tricky to know whether a PHEV or just a really efficient hybrid would be a better choice. If you must go to that location and there's no charging there and it's a fair distance and you do it fairly often, a regular hybrid may have the same greenhouse gas reductions as a plug-in that you don't plug in a lot. Plug-ins are great if you can plug in all the time or almost all the time, and you don't do a lot of really long trips. Once you have a lot of really long trips, or even a fair number of long trips, a regular hybrid is probably a lower emission vehicle, potentially. Yeah, I wish there was a place you could go to get like sort of a greenhouse gas consultant, you know, that you could call and say, here's my driving pattern, what's the most efficient vehicle to get? I realize for people that's a bit of a headache to try to sort that out, and maybe somebody knows where to get that information, but I don't offhand.
I'm going to check. Yeah, people agree. That's a tough one. Alan asks, do we have capacity in our grid if the EV market grows substantially? If it means an increase in nuclear generated electricity, does that impact the overall greenness of switching to EVs, or is nuclear now considered green? Ooh, that's a loaded question for lots of climate people in this room.
Oh yeah, and I'll come right out and say, I mean, I'm not a fan of nuclear as going forward, you know, the major source of our electricity in a low carbon world. I don't think it's going to solve the problems we need to solve. It's just not sustainable in any sort of circular, manageable, recyclable waste way. I also think the economics will look pretty bad if we really get right down to brass tacks on nuclear and say, what does it cost to make new nukes in Ontario if the public doesn't pay for the insurance, for instance? If you ask for a quote for a nuclear plant and the builder has to fund the insurance through the fees of electricity, I think it's a dead business. But there's a lot of momentum in Ontario with industry and the people that are well versed and capable of building nuclear plants. So it is an important question, and for sure right now running an EV in Ontario, you know, we know that over 50% of the electrons are coming from nuclear reactors, especially at night, but overall. But I also think that going forward, you know, the whole decarbonization of the world economy, but let's just look at Ontario for the moment. We know going towards 2050 that we basically have to turn everything into electrical power, whether it's our cars or our trains or our houses being heated. We're going to be converting to electrical systems, and this is going to require significant expansion of the grid. A fair amount of work has been done on this by various groups in Ontario or Canada, And it looks like somewhere in the range of 50 to 100% more electricity, probably by 2050. So yeah, we got to expand the grid. The government's been told this many times and has yet to fully engage on launching a major planning exercise for a zero carbon Ontario by 2050. I think we're gonna get there in terms of analysis eventually being done. And one of the parts of that is going to be, we're going to have to look at how do we make all this extra electricity to develop a low carbon economy. And like I say, it's probably between 50 and 100% more in the next 20 to 30 years. And so storage, repowering of hydroelectric systems, wind, solar, biomass, and nuclear is going to be probably thrown in the mix for being assessed. I wouldn't want to say, I wouldn't want to throw the dice on how that's going to turn out, but I personally hope that's not the future, because it's not sustainable for mankind to build nuclear plants. They only supply about 4% of the energy in Canada. So we would need 25 times as many nuclear plants as we have now if we wanted to really go low carbon and nuclear. And I don't see us building 25 times as much nuclear power as we have right now.
It's a good topic for a future discussion. I think with from the climate action team, lots of people will be interested to talk about that, and we'll invite you along too, Steve, for sure. I think I should turn it back over to Margot, who wants to kind of wrap up and share an action of the day for us. So I just want to thank everyone for putting all your questions in the chat, and Steve for so eloquently answering all of them. So I'll also make sure that all the resources, I know Henry suggested quite a few that went in the chat, get sent out in the email that our action team sends out to everyone that registered, including a link to the video recording from tonight. If you want to share it with friends, there's fantastic information here. So I just want to thank you again, Steve.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thanks for all the great questions. I see a few familiar faces out there. Great.
I want to thank you too, Steve. This has been absolutely fabulous. Thank you for giving your time and your knowledge and your enthusiasm. I think the world is headed towards EVs, and we all have to be prepared. So we always end with a call to action, and Steve has already mentioned plug and play. Sorry, plug and drive. And I would suggest that if anybody is thinking about buying an EV or would like to just have the fun of driving one, give a plug and drive a call, set up an appointment. And they're a non-profit facility in Toronto where you can book a sales-free, no pressure car to take out and drive. They've got a number of different kinds of vehicles. So I hope you'll do that. And we'll be, as Karen said, we'll be sending something out in an email to everyone so that you can contact Plug and Drive and stay in touch with all the information that everyone has given you, including Henry. Thank you, Henry. You've given us a lot of information as well. So thank you again for coming, everyone. And we hope you'll join us next time. And good night.
Good night, everyone.